Welcome everybody to our September edition of our Eco Districts Institute webinar series. Today we're talking affordable housing and the sort of movement and the evolution of the green affordable housing. Really pleased to be joined by a couple of old friends, Walker Wells and Kimberly Vermeer, who are going to share observations and lessons learned from many years in the trenches and working in the greening affordable housing sector. They are on a whirlwind Zoom and in-person tour related to their book that was published during the pandemic, Blueprint for Greening Affordable Housing, which is a follow-up to a book that they published over 10 years ago. So a lot has changed in the field of green building generally, certainly in the environment that we find ourselves doing this work, and how the trends and how the industry has evolved. So really excited to dig into affordable housing today. As I mentioned, both Kim and Walker have been doing this for a long time. I've known them both for a long time. Walker is a longtime Eco Districts faculty and studio member. I met both of these folks many years ago when we were toiling in the early days of the U.S. Green Building Council and the Green Build conferences. I was to start my career up in Portland, Oregon, where I was working on green building policy, including affordable housing and bringing affordable housing into green building, which became a set of standards in my home city that ultimately the city of Seattle took, and then Enterprise and Dana Borland and her team took. So the three of us have been in this space for quite a long time, although it's been quite a long time since I've been doing it. And we're really pleased to have both Kim and Walker here, who combined have over 50 years of experience in two practices spanning both coasts. Kim is based in Boston with her firm Urban Habitat Initiatives, and Walker is now with Ramey and Associates, but for a long time was helped lead the Global Green organization in LA, and he's based in the Los Angeles area. So not only a lot of experience, but of experience on two coasts, working in very different climates politically and also geographically and from a climate perspective. So I think we're going to learn a lot about how green building has evolved throughout the country. So without any further ado, I want to jump into the conversation. I do want to thank the Bullitt Foundation and Kim and Walker's organization and the Kresge Foundation and Rethink for their support for this conversation and the support of the organization as a whole. I'll come back at the end of the conversation to talk about the rest of the webinar series for the fall. Some exciting news with a new training program that we're launching tomorrow called Centering Racial Equity in Eco Districts. So more to come on that. Without further ado, I'd like to jump into the presentation with Walker and Kim.
Okay, thanks, Rob.
Okay, I'm gonna pull up the presentation here.
And as you're doing that, Kim, I failed to mention real quickly, for those of you after the presentation and throughout the presentation, feel free to use your Q&A function to answer questions. I will be consolidating those questions, and during the Q&A, I will be pulling the questions that you have throughout the conversation into the final 15 or 20 minutes.
Okay, great. And again, thanks, Rob. And it's exciting to get to be part of this Eco District series, having tuned in to many of them and been inspired. So fun to continue to be part of the bigger Eco Districts family. And Kim and I are excited to share this book that we put together and that did come out during the pandemic. So we've had a number of opportunities to do this sort of event using Zoom like we're doing today. The picture you saw earlier was Kim and myself in San Diego at the Green Build conference, where we had our first in-person book talk, which was super fun. And what was fun about it was that we had some great kind of conversation and back and forth about the sort of why we wrote the book and what's in it and where things are going. So I hope we can do something similar today with the Q&A or with the chat and have a bit of a dialogue and a discussion. Here's our agenda. We want to talk about sort of these trends that have become the current context. Kim and I had identified, a few things that we felt were going on related to green affordable housing when we got to the end of the book. So, we covered all the important topics and we said, okay, well, let's try and look over the horizon a little bit. And, we saw health, we saw equity, we saw resilience. We saw the need to move beyond the building, which is a great tie into eco districts and, seeing green affordable housing as a catalyst or an anchor to an eco districts. And then many of these things have, not just been sort of emerging trends, but the context for our work, that we're currently involved in. Want to share some of the key issues that are confronting practitioners, and that's really who this book is focused on, are people in the practice of designing and developing affordable housing, and to show how green can be interwoven with that practice. I want to share sort of an overview of our book, both the sort of the key elements of the chapters, but also some of the case studies. And I think nearly half the book, it consists of case studies. There's 14 case studies from all over the country that we'll touch on a little bit at the end. And so I touched on these already, sort of, climate. Obviously, last few weeks, we've had Climate Week and these reports from the IPCC. So, climate issues continue to sort of dominate the conversation related to sort of sustainability. And then I talked about green beyond the building. Then Kim has been involved in a number of things with US Green Building Council on equity. I've been involved with some of the equity issues with the Lead for Cities and Communities program. So Kim, if you just want to touch on those two topics.
Yeah, I think we all, last year brought social equity and inequity and the need for us to be actively anti-racist. I'm gonna unplug my phone. No one ever calls, right? Except in the middle of a webinar.
Yes.
I think we've all had a new realization that our work has to not only be equitable, but it has to be actively anti-racist. And we're all finding new ways to talk about this and new ways to really figure out how to bring that into our work. So that's becoming a really important driver. And of course, housing and health, there's continued frustrations that these seem to be things that we treat in separate silos of funding and attention, and that more and more we need to bring them together. And of course, COVID, is home a safe place? What does it mean to work from home, school from home in terms of health and wellness? All of those are new questions that we're facing in housing. And suddenly we're in the middle of trying to figure all of that out.
Yeah, this slide just sort of reemphasizes that point. And when we were writing about health, it was some of the more classic issues of carbon monoxide from combustion, humidity, dampness, particulate matter, dust, all these asthma triggers. But with COVID, it certainly brought health issues to the forefront, and I think emphasized a number of the things that one does with a green design, about unit compartmentalization, tight facade, good air filtration, these types of things. But this sort of need to ensure that health is in the conversation, really kind of was re-emphasized by some of the data that's come out about sort of these overlaps between sort of redlining and other sort of racist housing policies, and and a number of other sort of health related issues. So if we can look at this slide. So this is just overlaying the Chicago, Cook County, just things that many of us have seen, that the incidence of COVID-19 infections, had a fairly strong correlation to the historic patterns of redlining or, discriminatory lending practices. So people in places with poor quality housing also were having a higher incidence of exposure to COVID-19. For me, this is like realizing that many of the things that have happened in the past cast a long shadow into the present and into the future. So, redlining isn't just a thing that happened, it's a thing that like it's sort of continuing to happen or continues to resonate going forward. So like we need to fold that into our design process. And then here's just another example about tree canopy cover, which of course relates to exposure to urban heat and extreme temperatures due to urban heat island effect. And so and how that relates to redlining practices in Richmond, Virginia. And we can go to the next slide.
And then just a little more on the social equity piece of this, the COVID really brought to the forefront housing insecurity. And when people lost their jobs, they were threatened with the loss of their housing as well. And this was affecting what turned out to be what we now call our essential worker workforce, right? And so it has brought new awareness to the importance of having affordable housing, restricted housing that gives people predictable costs, that gives them a place to stay even when they face these kind of challenges, protects them a little bit from the vagaries of the market. And this health and resilience, how we think about all of this and how we've begun to think of in new ways about how housing and health connect. We often find affordable housing focusing on infill development, filling in missing teeth in neighborhoods that have been stressed by disinvestment over the past decades. And making sure that we implement the green construction practices of tight building envelopes, good filtration, good air throughput to really reduce people's exposures to both pollutants and to pathogens. And making sure that the materials that we're using aren't off-gassing toxic and cancer-causing chemicals into homes. And ventilation, and then thinking in new ways about how to use the community spaces and the common areas in buildings, and thinking about ways that they can be resources, not just for the residents, but for the surrounding community, and can be potentially a resilience hub or a community gathering place as we face health and climate challenges.
And just to provide a little bit of framing, which is what this first section is all about, is just to clarify that our book focuses on affordable housing that sometimes I'll say with a capital A, which is housing that will be formally income restricted or have subsidized rent. And so it is, I think, interesting, and something that was kind of brought home for me too, was that it's not a small number of units that are being built with these different sort of subsidized financial tools. So like the low-income housing tax credit. So 20% of the housing starts 80,000 units annually. And then most of them in some form or another are using a tax credit structure, often the low-income housing tax credit, which then is used to leverage private investment. And then we'll see this on the next slide, some research that we did when I was at Global Green that just looked at the states that have incorporated some degree of green building into their qualified allocation plans. And the qualified allocation plans, or QAPs, are what's used to allocate the low-income housing tax credit. So, this is work that a number of people have been involved in for, 15 years or so at this point. But to just get some of the fundamentals of energy efficiency, water conservation, health, access to neighborhood resources into these sort of fundamental driving documents for how the tax credits get allocated. And I think this is through sort of proof of concept that's come through the many, many projects that have been built over the years. So green affordable housing stopped to feel like a exotic outlier, heroic undertaking, but started to move more and more towards sort of, standard practice, at least at the sort of fundamental levels of green building. Not nationwide, but a good number of the states have adopted these practices, and I think seen the value that green brings to the public investment in affordable housing. All right. got to keep up with which ones are mine and which ones are Kim's. And so this slide is just here to just show that affordable housing can come in many shapes and sizes. And these are all projects that are featured in our case studies. But you see this high-rise multi-building development in East Harlem by Jonathan Rose Companies, Darrow Verde, Second Street Studios, which is housing for the formerly homeless in San Jose, First Community Housing. Aeon, the Rose in Minneapolis, was that 4-story building, some home ownership, and then a sort of smaller, more residential scale in New Hampshire. And what's, of course, the specific strategies change, but the fundamental principles, all hold true about reducing utility costs, improving health, thinking about durability, and then increasingly thinking about how each of these developments can be part of a resilience network in its community. So why did we write the book? We have a little excerpt here from our respective prefaces. This is a harder question to answer than you might think. Part of it, as Rob mentioned, is that there was an earlier version of the book that needed to be updated. But then to take the plunge and say, this is where I'm going to put a lot of energy, we really had to feel that the practice of green affordable housing is valuable, and that an updated book could be a useful tool for practitioners. And so this excerpt here is something I've said for a long time, which is each of these green affordable housing developments becomes a little microcosm of urban sustainability. So when someone says, Walker, what does urban sustainability mean? I can say, well, it can mean all of these systemic things, but here's an example where these different issues come together about environment and equity and economics in a tangible form that you can go visit. And then you can start to see those as, again, catalytic sort of interventions that start to show us what this sustainable urbanism or even a restorative model of development could look like. So that's a little bit of where I was coming from, to say, how do we basically get more of these projects done quickly, and in I think in a way that is where it is sort of expected practice, and where each project is expiring the next one down the line.
And for me, I completely support Walker's approach and motivations. For me, just working with practitioners and knowing that a typical real estate developer is juggling so many things, the permitting, the financing, managing the design team, that's hard. They know they have a commitment, they want to be green, but knowing how to do it and having in one place the key things that they need to be able to get their team to deliver for them was so important. And then as we pulled together new examples for the case studies, I just found that to be so inspirational. The passion and the commitment that the folks who are doing this work bring to it. And another interesting thing that we observed is that their work of doing individual green buildings has really transformed many of them into urbanists, people saying it can't just be about a project, it's got to be about a neighborhood, it's got to be about a whole community. And it's also transformed their organizations to say our organization really has to be committed to green. So we hope that, as people read the book, they can share that inspiration and can learn and grow through what's in the book. Oh,
and then, yeah.
Go ahead.
And eventually, Kim and I worked up this diagram that we felt is a good way to capture our intent, which is to place the project manager at the low-income housing development organization in the center. And those are the people that we're really trying to help and give enough guidance to so they can navigate through this green process with some confidence, while they navigate through all kinds of other processes about land purchase and entitlements and hiring a design team and dealing with local government and stacking up all the financing. And so in the presentation, we're going to walk through some of these steps, but you see sort of in the inner core there's the connection to the communities, there's a discussion of the integrated design process, recognition that you need to make the financing part of the design conversation, as things need to get paid for. There needs to be obviously oversight during construction. Kim's going to talk about operations, and we've already touched quite a bit on these sort of broader health and well-being issues as some of the sort of core issues. And then the next ring out speaks to how those can be addressed or thought about or folded into these projects as they go through the design and construction process.
And we were really honored that Jonathan Rose agreed to write the foreword for our book. He's a New York-based developer who very early on committed to sustainability and green in the development of affordable housing. And as you can see, you can read his quote. I don't need to read the whole thing, but he is in this realm of saying, you know, it's not just that we're building better buildings, but this is a socially and environmentally restorative justice approach to building in community, and the spirit of our book. So how the book is laid out is we've got a chapter of why greening affordable housing and just laying out this premise of equity, as well as environment and economy as being the baseline for why we do this work. And then the development process of an integrated design, all the elements that go into a building, how the funding flows. Then a chapter on green operations, and then trends that we've already talked about. We'll get back to those. And then the 14 case studies. So we're going to give you a fast trip through the book. So chapter 1 is making the case. And that is really thinking about how does this project fit into a larger realm of social justice and community redevelopment. And building on the well-known definition of sustainability, that we're looking at ways to build that meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs, and really trying to balance environment, economy, and social equity as we do this work. And this, of course, has been a driver of the eco-districts frame since its beginnings, right? That if work isn't grounded in equity, what's the point, right? And if, as we go for more environmentally responsible solutions, we need to be thinking about them on the community scale, because that's the way that we are doing more socially equitable environmental work. And of course, we have to balance that in the larger economic context, and from family economies to neighborhood economies to cities to regions. And this little table just kind of plays these off. It says, okay, if affordable housing, if we take these equity, economy, environment elements, affordable housing is delivering safe and decent homes. Often providers are also offering social programs and basic services, and creating opportunities for stable mix of incomes within communities. Stable housing costs are key to family economies. Families, if they know they have safe, affordable, predictable cost housing, they can get on with the rest of their lives, getting their kids into school, finding jobs, getting better education, all those other things. When housing is insecure, it's so much harder to make all those other things happen in families' lives. And in terms of environment, most affordable housing is located in what we would call better locations, eco-district land use type people, where there's access to transit and services, and gives people opportunities to get about with their daily business without necessarily needing a car. But if we think about the way that green building layers onto that, then it's offering healthier indoor environments because of the emphasis on good ventilation, low toxicity materials. There's an explicit call for physical activity with connections to biking and walking. And using safer construction approaches and materials means that we're not only protecting the residents who will live there, but the construction workers and the manufacturing workers, by selecting products that are healthier. And in terms of economy, if we're reducing the cost, that is ensuring the durability and the long-term resilience of both families and property owners. And then in terms of environment, as we make these changes, we reduce the pressure on the environment for the building that we're doing. So these two things go hand in hand, affordable housing and green building for affordable housing. Walker, back to you.
Thank you, Kim. So that's sort of the setup, putting all of this in the context of sort of basic right to shelter, and then in a larger frame of sustainability. And then we dive into some of the things about actually how to do green affordable housing. And in our discussions about what had changed over the last 12 years, a lot of the building techniques and materials systems have changed, but some of the fundamentals that we've learned about green building continue to hold true. And using or relying on an integrated design process is certainly part of it. And and what you realize is that yes, a building is a system made of other systems, mechanical, plumbing, electrical, stormwater, circulation, safety. But design is a process, and so what we decided to really focus on was, at least initially, is what this process could look like. Again, drawing from our our experiences. So just to reemphasize this point, that earlier is better, and at least in my experience, the opportunity to capture these green benefits, the green ideas, is once you're in sort of schematic design, conceptual design, maybe schematics, like there's lots of space in there to have these conversations about what about battery backup, what about a net zero building, how about a gray water system that uses the drainage from the laundry room. Once you start crossing over into construction documents, things get to be very expensive, because you're paying to undo things, or sort of undo a decision and make a new decision, which all speaks to many of these ideas about when to have a charrette and how to fold green into the design process. But what we also discussed is this idea of just extending what we think of as design, and going back to, where's the building? Is it close to transit and services and resources? How have you maximized your density and minimized your parking in most instances? That's the move. What are you getting as your approvals or entitlements? And then thinking about some of these fundamental issues of massing, orientation, sort of general layout of the building and schematic design. Somewhere in there is the right time to have the design charrette, when there's enough done to talk about, but things aren't set in stone. And then each of these numbers tracks to a description in the book, but after the charrette number 4, there's research, cost emating, deciding what you're actually going to do, and number 7, putting it into your construction document, so it's in the the pieces of paper that matter out in the site, and then following through in construction, and also acknowledging maybe number 11 that we didn't put in is operations and maintenance, because certainly you can design it and build it green, and then fall off a cliff in operations and maintenance if you don't have the right people involved, trained correctly. And so we kind of go through each of these steps, and so again, sort of stretching what we call design. And then we touch on these best practices in green design, which I'm going to go through fairly quickly, but just to remind ourselves of what the palette looks like. So we've talked about location and site design, how you're going to manage water on the site, if it's going to be retained on site or filtered before it goes off, energy efficiency combined with renewables, looking at materials, both each material individually, but also how these materials need to go together, and then also the relationship to indoor environmental quality and health again. So here's just a few fundamentals that we put down that sometimes get forgotten. Where are you on the planet? Which way's south? What's the sun angle? Which way should your roof point if you want to maximize solar and natural daylighting? You can go to the next slide. This is here we go. The North Santa Fe Apartments in Vista, California is very close, sort of nearly adjacent to a new commuter rail line. So not only are the residents in a building that has stabilized rent, fairly predictable energy costs, but they have access to a form of transportation that can get them, if they want to, into San Diego. and ideally enable them to avoid having a car or maybe having two cars, which provides a whole series of economic benefits. Next slide. Number of ways to look at stormwater that we see, whether it's a green roof, a dry well, bioswales, but increasingly the effort is to get the water in the ground and not just put it into the waterway and dump it into the stream or ocean, and see it as a resource and really as a resilience resource to have the water in the soil and into the aquifers. And then of course, all that green infrastructure helps with urban heat island. Water related items have improved significantly, although one still gets the you have to flush it 2 times story. But for the most part, you can see, shower heads and toilets that are very, very water efficient and meet the water sense label. So this is a straightforward practice. And then this combination of energy and renewables. And, of course, looking at making an energy efficient building envelope, good windows, well insulated, walls, efficient equipment. And then bringing in this conversation of, how much energy can we make on site? And then what are we going to do with it? And, there's, depending on where you're located, you may or may not be able to do net metering. You may or may not be able to do virtual net metering. So what often drives these renewable energy decisions is sometimes spatial, but often regulatory. And which meter is the solar going to get credited towards? Or if you can make more than you need for the house meter, do you have a provision to share it with the tenants? And at least in California, lots of discussion about storage these days, and batteries, and not just running the meter backward, but capturing some of that energy for future use, whether it's to avoid high cost of energy or to, again, be a resilience resource. So the building can operate autonomously for some period of time if there's a grid interruption. We discuss materials and go through a whole range of things, paint, adhesives, flooring, and look at them individually. But this sort of simple wall section is shown to just remind us that there's how these buildings relate to each other is important as well. How the drainage plane works, where insulation is located, thinking of the movement of water, thinking of the movement of thermal energy, and again, how that's integrated into the design and integrated into the plans and specs. Next slide. And then finally on indoor environmental quality. So when possible, the no smoking regulation is a great way to go. Not always feasible given the population of who's going to live in the building. There's a pragmatism element to all of this. Right sizing the systems and making sure we're not actually putting in things that are too large, that short cycle and don't work well. And then thinking about the ventilation system, whether it's centrally distributed or whether there's a dedicated fresh air intake for each of the units. Not so long ago, those fresh air intakes didn't necessarily have a filter. The only filter would be if you turned on the actual HVAC system. But at least in California, having an inline MERV 11 filter has become standard practice in the building code. So we're bringing in outside air and we're filtering it before it ever hits anybody's lungs, which I feel is a big step forward.
All right, well, that was Walker's 10 minutes through how to build a green building. And so now I'm going to give us 2 minutes on how to pay for it, or at least how to think about paying for it. And so we, of course, know that we have to figure out how to pay for things. But I think one of the challenges that developers of green affordable housing try to overcome is thinking about costs as being more than just about the money, right? We have to think about both costs and benefits as something that extends beyond just a strict first cost analysis of projects. And the more we're able to say, okay, what I'm really building for is residents, and how am I going to build to maximize their health and well-being, as well as their financial security, makes us think differently about how to assess costs and how to identify funding to meet the monetary costs of building projects. And one issue that comes up over and over again in thinking about costs and affordable housing is how the split incentives between investments in things that do save money or things that cost money. For example, ventilation systems can sometimes cost the owner more than not having a ventilation system. But in affordable rents, the rent is determined based on an assumption of what the unit rent and the utility costs for living in that unit are going to be. And that utility cost is structured as a utility allowance. And so, and those are standard, there are tables of them for every metro area in the United States put out every year by HUD. And based on the mix of fuels and the type of equipment that are in apartments. So these are very standardized, scheduled things based on existing, not very efficient housing. So if we looked at the gross rent, maybe it's $1,000, but maybe in a given location, that utility allowance for what the tenant is going to be expected to pay is $150. So the net rent to the owner is going to be $850. Well, if the owner makes investments in things that are going to save on the utility bills, then many jurisdictions are now allowing the owner to go back and get a utility allowance that's based on that energy efficiency. And usually that's done in the way that the tenants get a little bit of that benefit and the owners get a little bit of that benefit. So it's a shared benefit. So then the owner has that additional revenue that can be used to offset some of the costs. So many developers are using this approach to be able to increase the amount of mortgage debt that they're able to get in their capital financing for a project as one way of gaining back some of the benefit of implementing efficiency in their buildings. This is an example of creative financing, because we know that people who are building affordable housing and community developers are creative thinkers about how to find the resources they need to do what they want to do. And this group is HomeWise, based in Santa Fe, and they are a community development financial institution, or a CDFI. And because of that, they were able to figure out a very clever way to bring the new markets tax credits into the financing pool that they made available for the mortgage loans for the people who got financing through them to buy their homes. And this is, if I can explain a little bit more of that, but won't do so now. But if people want to talk about that more in Q&A, we could do that, or we can have a follow-up conversation, or I can put you in touch with the HomeWise people about that. But it was a very clever way, and what that enabled them to do was to put solar PV on every single home, so that this was their first foray into doing all electric homes. And by putting the PV on, families could have a high efficiency electrified home that they could afford to live in. And then once it's been built, you know, as Walker said, if we don't think about how we're going to run it, then it can be a lot of good work that is for naught. And so really, as we're building, of course, that first thing is to make sure that we are setting our operations people up to succeed in keeping projects green. And that means training, it means operations manuals, it means continual attention to the buildings and the systems and the retraining as staff turnover, as residents turnover. But there are tremendous opportunities with existing properties. And keep in mind that even at the pace that we're going, 10 years from now, we'll only have replaced 10% of our housing stock, right? So we are every year, we've got 99% of our stock is existing, right? And so it's really critical that we think about ways to green our existing stock. And that can be done in a lot of ways through operations and management. And for owners that have many properties, then they can really start thinking at that portfolio level and asset management about ways to be greener. And they're going to be forced to do so. by many local ordinances and things as more and more places aim for carbon neutrality by 2035 or 2040 or 2050. And so in existing housing, just at a minimum, track what you're consuming, energy and water. Installing water conservation measures is one of the lowest cost and fastest payback measures to save money and save water. And thinking about from a health and from a green point of view, integrated pest management, or IPM as a strategy, is really important for reducing the toxicity of the products that are used for pest management. And of course, all of the health issues around asthma and other just general ickiness about having pests in homes. And then transitioning to green cleaning products, making sure that when you're repainting, it's with low VOC paints, implementing smoke-free housing programs. And I can't read the last one on my slide because my banner is blocking it, but you can read it.
So there's some resident engagement strategies.
Oh, yeah. Residents. If residents don't know what's going on, residents aren't going to be able to help you to make your building greener. So thinking about that. And so with operations under control, well, that brings us back to chapter 6, which is where we started. And Walker, back to you.
Okay, well, I think we can, I'm trying to get synced up here. All right. Did we want to talk? Well, let me just do this. I see it's 11:42 and there's a bunch of Q&A. So maybe we want to not talk about all of the case studies or do them briefly, because I do want to have this dialogue. So I think we can maybe.
Why don't you hit on a couple?
Yeah, maybe Kim, you just want to talk about Orchards at Orinco?
Sure. So this is a Portland based, it's actually out in the suburbs outside of Portland at the end of a transit line. And it was a master plan community, but had very little affordable housing. And so REACH, a large active not-for-profit organization in Portland, built 57 units in this phase 1. And they decided to do it passive house. So they were a very early passive house multifamily project. And they have had to have a really strong resident engagement program to understand how the turns out that someone else said it, but it takes a lot of active living to live in a passive home. And this is one of those cases. So there's had to be a lot of work, but the housing is located right at transit, gets people into town. It's also affordable housing in a place where there's a lot of back office for the medical services industry. And so it's giving people access to good jobs and housing that they can afford, as well as giving them access back into town.
Okay, and I can just touch on Century Villages at Cabrillo, a project I've been involved with for the last seven or 8 years that combines two new buildings with permanent housing. This is a location that was largely providing transitional housing, often to veterans. And so the first couple of moves were sort of new LEED Platinum and then LEED Gold buildings. But then that became a catalyst for them to explore looking at the whole area as a village, not just in name, but in practice. And then pursuing the LEED for neighborhood development certification for their master plan. And this was partly supported by the Affordable Green Neighborhoods grants that USGBC was providing through funding from Bank of America. So if we go to the next slide, you can just get a sense of the scale of things. This is the most recent building with these sort of 3 fingers, but over on the right, you start to see how they fit into a larger master plan of providing a town square, moving a bus into the village to address some of the access issues, thinking more carefully about the open space and how it's used for stormwater management, but for recreation, and also just creating connections between the buildings. So I've always thought this is really interesting, how a singular building really did become the catalyst for looking at things at a neighborhood or district scale.
And then this last example, this is senior housing, affordable senior housing in the middle of a transit-oriented development in Decatur, which is on the MARTA. It's in Atlanta. It's a separate city, but it's adjacent to Atlanta. And so this was part of a master plan and used the Earthcraft Communities certification for laying out the mix of uses, market rate housing, some commercial and retail, the senior housing, some walking connections to Decatur, and of course, being right on the transit line. And just some examples of all the different things that were included in the green building part of Decatur East.
Yeah. And then just there you were seeing sort of what the case studies look like, which lists the green features, but we also spent a lot of time tracking down the money and figuring out what sources of financing we're paying for all of this. And then just last two slides, as we tried to sort of think about some of these fundamental drivers of these green projects, we came back to collaboration and sort of having a shared vision. We want this to be a green project that people can buy into or express support from, that there needs to be a structure and process for figuring out how the green will be integrated. It can't just happen by happenstance. People need to bring their skills and professionally, but sort of a behavior, a sense of openness and curiosity to commit through that scope of the project to bringing in the green elements. And there's, as we know, in any collaboration, there's a big element of trust and having trusted partners, so people are willing to stretch and reach and try things that may be a little risky, in the hope of moving the practice forward. And then final slide from Jonathan Rose: just every reader of this book who puts the ideas and strategies in it into practice will be weaving threads in the tapestry of solutions that together create a more just and resilient society. We are all grateful for your work. So that's, I thought, a nice way to round things out, and then I think open for Q&A.
Yeah.
Great, thank you both. Why don't we take off the share screen so we can have a conversation between the three of us. I've been monitoring the Q&A and the chat, and appreciate everybody who's weighing in. There's a variety of comments. There's a variety of questions that are large, some quite technical and precise regarding things like parking minimums and financing solar. I think, though, I want to start with a question around the context. And one of the comments made was moving from community engagement to centering the work in the residents. And I want to ask you too about when you went to sort of research this book, and also in your experience working with community development organizations and other housing providers, are you seeing a move to integrate a much deeper engagement with residents around the design of buildings, really elevating issues of culture, issues of practical use, and some of the emerging issues that we're seeing, work from home, health implications? Can you talk a little bit about where you see the affordable housing industry moving as it relates to really centering the work around a different style and a more intentional a model of community engagement?
Mm-hmm. I can start. So, a challenge with many of the projects is you don't know who's going to live there, and you can't decide, ahead of time who will. This is part of just fair housing, that, buildings will be built, and then there's often a lottery to figure out who the residents will be. So it creates a challenging situation with the stakeholder engagement. The place where that'll differ is with the public housing redevelopment, because often there's sort of a temporary relocation, and then people will be moving back in. And so on the Hope 6 or Choice Neighborhoods projects, that's where I've seen the ability to go sort of deeper with the residents and ask the people who are going to come in back and live there what they're interested in. And then once people have moved in, then I've certainly seen plenty of examples of, sort of, I don't know if I'd call it deep engagement, but certainly outreach and education around green practices, green cleaning and the benefits of, turning off your air conditioner and opening the windows, and, sort of getting them to participate in the green features in the building. But I don't know if that's engagement as much as just education and encouragement.
And are you seeing, just to kind of continue that thread, are you seeing projects that are being more intentional about, the workforce development and, engaging minority and women-owned businesses along the supply chain of designing and developing the buildings, being thoughtful about, the wraparound services and how they sort of match up? What are you seeing in over the years, and really activating around the supply chain issues of what you're what's happening in green building and affordable housing?
Yeah, so I can talk to what's happening in Boston. All of the funding programs for affordable housing have minimum standards, and most of my clients here set their own project goals at much higher levels than those. So they're aiming for 50% local hiring, which is quite ambitious, and setting strong percentages for minority-owned business and women-owned business participation. So it's a mix of minimum requirements coming from the funding sources with additional requirements being layered on by my clients.
And I haven't seen so much about the, again, the minority-owned or women-owned business in the contracting, but at least in LA, almost all the projects are permanently supportive housing. So there's certainly the services and partnerships with the developers and these different service providers, whether it's addiction or mental health or other kinds of counseling. I mean, this becomes a little bit of a policy story though, like, the regulations will drive a lot of the behavior, and then the money will drive a lot of the behavior. So right now in Los Angeles, a good portion of the local funding for affordable housing is housing for the formerly homeless. And then there's an understanding that the permanently supportive housing is like the model that's proven to be most effective. So that's what's largely getting built. And so, there's maybe sort of strings attached to the policy or the funding.
Yeah.
I want to highlight a couple. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, no, I just wanted to circle back to the last question because, I have clients going through their funding applications right now for our local and state programs. And, the design guidelines call for pretty small units at all, whether it's studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, right? And if we start to think that we really need space for work from home space or school from home space, it's not being funded. And when the cost per square foot is approaching, $500 for hard costs, and most of that is subsidy, it's really hard to talk the funders into increasing the allowable space in the design standards for some of these things. So I think there has to be some deep thinking about small space design that offers more flexibility, and also whether some of the design standards need to allow for a little more space per family to facilitate and enable more flexibility about work from home.
That's great. That's appreciate you picking up on that. And I think that speaks to the sort of evolving nature of what's happening, whether it be COVID, and so the extension of homes into workplaces, and what can affordable housing providers do to either provide more flex space in the building for those kind of activities, sort of shared office, if you will, spaces, or working with partners in the communities or the neighborhoods that they are located. I want to just highlight a couple resources for folks to go on the sort of issue of engaging and centering community design. A really interesting effort out of the Hilltop neighborhood in Tacoma. One of our partners, Methuen Architects, worked with a nonprofit called Fab 5 to design a really community-driven and often kind of art and youth-driven design process with an affordable housing project at Frontera, who's a land trust in the Seattle area was delivering in a neighborhood that's going through a tremendous amount of gentrification and worry in a Black community of of anti-displacement. So Fab Five worked in sort of pre-work with the community, even though, as Walker mentioned, you're designing for often folks that you don't know who are going to occupy that building. So there really is a need to be creative with housing providers to collaborate in pre-work with community-based groups. And in the case of the Hilltop, a tremendous amount of community vision and community involvement that I think is a really interesting model. Enterprise Community Partners, who Kim and Walker know well, their design team based in Boston recently published centering a framework for health and healing centered community development. I think that's a great resource as well for our listeners on these issues of centering community. Last question. There's a lot of questions that are pointing to the context in which affordable housing becomes a catalyst. And can you speak to, in your case studies or in your own, again, your own experience, are any of the projects you're seeing becoming, being integrated into additional strategic planning at the neighborhood level for climate planning or resiliency planning or anti-displacement strategies? Are you working in places where there's a broader context which this housing, sits? And I think classically we think of transit-oriented development as part of that, right? Like these, projects can sit if there's a strategy around transit and walkability, et cetera. But talk to the listeners about what you're seeing and the sort of additional planning that's going into some of the projects that you highlight.
So two of our case studies, I think, are great examples of that, Rob. And one is the Community Housing Works project, North Santa Fe Apartments. That was one of the cases that we highlighted. And that was a very low-rise, low-density suburban community. And the North Santa Fe Apartments was one of the first to be not even hugely dense, but 30 units per acre, and being a 4-story building. And what that did was a proof of concept for that community that kind of scale and that kind of housing could be okay. And so that has become a real catalyst for zoning changes and additional approvals of that mid-rise, mid-scale housing in that community.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, Rob, because sometimes the buildings are just these singular investments, and they're awesome in their own right, but they aren't necessarily triggering other things around them. Or they might be part of a citywide desire to build permanently supportive housing, but it's not necessarily a neighborhood move. And then I can think of some that are very much that case. So this Block X, it's called, in San Francisco, which is the first new building that's part of the Rebuild Potrero plan. So, a massive plan to, demolish and rebuild in more of a traditional neighborhood pattern, large public housing development in San Francisco. And this was interesting because there was lots and lots of planning and fantastic work done by Van Meter Williams Pollock. But then, finding the money for all the horizontal infrastructure and rebuilding streets, et cetera, was really challenging. But, there was one parcel that was fairly straightforward to build on. And so that kind of got things going. And then, that again was a catalyst towards moving onwards with realizing this larger plan for the neighborhood. And then I would say there's a similar thing happening in Los Angeles and Watts with Jordan Downs that started with a master plan by Dan Solomon, now Methune's office, to double the density, integrate the street grid, bring in transit, introduce retail in a fairly rundown public housing development. And then what's happened there is a lot of that fundamental, the retail infrastructure, the street grid, extending a significant Street Century Boulevard has happened and really already knit some of that community together with the surrounding area. And then we're slowly going through phase 1A, phase 1B, phase 2A, phase 2B. But I know that the injection new money into that area has already reaped some benefits for the surrounding community. And then I think they're adding so many units that there may not even be so much of a gentrification pressure, because they're actually able to increase density, while I think maintaining a fair amount of open space and providing resources for the surrounding neighborhood.
That's great. Well, we're going to have to leave it at that. It's coming up on the noon hour here on the West Coast. So much to get into. There's more questions about retrofit versus new.
I know. I'd love
I
to
see
talk about
great
that.
questions in the chat. Well,
Yeah,
Rob,
what we'll do.
will you let me do a plug for my podcast before we go?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Sure.
All right. Well, I love the case study part of the book so much that I've launched a podcast called Green in Action. And we're using the podcast to celebrate these stories of green leadership and affordable housing. So you can see over my shoulder, Green in Action. You can you can get it at Google, at Spotify, at Apple. You can get more information about it at my website, urbanhabitatinitiatives.com. And the current episode that just dropped this week is about a passive house and Fitwell certified project in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
That's great. And we will take, as Tev and I do, we will take some of these questions and we will get them over to you, Walker and Kim, for some follow-up. This has been recorded. Folks are asking for the resources that I highlighted as well. The Fab 5 Design the Hill. If you Google that, that's a great document and resource and centering community. I'm sorry, framework for health-centered community development on the community enterprise community partners website. We also have a webinar on from Nella Young and Chandra Christmas Rouse on that enterprise framework from last year that you can find on our website. Thanks again. I know we're over time. I just want to say before we say goodbye, and thank you to Walker and Kim, that we have 3 more webinars this fall, a terrific lineup next month. We're going to be joined by Cindy Wu, formerly who headed up the Chinatown CDC efforts around their green development work, and now runs the Bay Area LISC office, and reflecting on just green enough and the issues of green building and green infrastructure and how it impacts at-risk communities from gentrification and displacement, in particularly in the context of the Chinese American community in Chinatown and San Francisco. So a really interesting conversation with Cindy next month, and you'll see more of this coming out through our social media feeds and our e-blast. So thanks again to Walker and Kim. There's so much here. We encourage everyone to pick up their book and follow up with them individually as well. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good to be
Bye.
here.